Sarah Mitchell stood at the front of her classroom at Lincoln High, her marker squeaking against the whiteboard as she scribbled a quote from Toni Morrison's Beloved. The room buzzed with the low hum of teenage energy pencils tapping, sneakers scuffing the linoleum. A few whispered conversations. Her 11th graders were a mix of faces, black, Latino, white, and everything in between, each with their own spark. She loved this part of teaching, the moment when a kid's eyes lit up, connecting a story to their own life. But today, her mind wasn't on the lesson. It was on Jamal Carter, one of her brightest students, who wasn't in his usual seat by the window. Jamal, a lanky 16-year-old with a quick laugh and a knack for poetry, had been suspended yesterday. His crime? Disruptive behavior, according to the vice principal's report. Sarah had been in the hallway when it happened. Jamal had been joking with a friend, his voice a little loud, maybe, but nothing out of the ordinary for a high school corridor between classes. A white kid, Connor, had been roughhousing nearby, shoving another boy into a locker. Connor got a verbal warning. Jamal got 3 days out of school. It wasn't the first time Sarah had seen this kind of disparity, but it was the first time it hit her like a punch to the gut. Lincoln High sat in a mid-sized city in Ohio, a place where the Rust Belt decline lingered in the cracked sidewalks and shuttered factories. The school itself was a sprawling brick building, its hallways lined with faded posters about college dreams and anti-bullying campaigns. It served a diverse student body, about 40% black, 30% Latino, 25% white, and a handful of others. On paper, it was a model of integration. In practice, Sarah was starting to see the cracks. Black and Latino students were disciplined at triple the rate of their white peers, according to the district's own data, which she'd stumbled across in a staff meeting last month. Suspensions, detentions, even expulsions, they all skewed heavily toward kids like Jamal. Sarah had been teaching at Lincoln for 5 years, ever since she'd moved back to her hometown after college. At 32, she was still young enough to relate to her students, but old enough to feel the weight of the system she worked in. She wasn't naive. She knew schools weren't perfect, but she'd always believed that good teachers could make a difference, one kid at a time. Now, she wasn't so sure. The memory of Jamal's face, defiant but hurt as he was escorted out of the building, kept replaying in her mind. She'd tried to intervene, asking Vice Principal Hargrove why Jamal was being singled out. Hargrove, a weary man with a permanent frown, had brushed her off. "We have a zero-tolerance policy, Sarah. You know that. Zero tolerance." The phrase grated on her. It was supposed to mean fairness, but it felt like a weapon. She'd seen it used to suspend a black girl for disrespect after questioning a teacher's comment, while a white boy who'd cursed out a coach got a pat on the back and a cool-off period. The rules seemed to bend depending on who you were. Sarah had always prided herself on being fair in her own classroom, but fairness wasn't enough when the whole system seemed rigged. That night, Sarah sat at her kitchen table, a glass of untouched wine beside her laptop. She'd pulled up the district's disciplinary records, which were public but buried deep on the website. The numbers confirmed what she'd suspected. Black students made up 40% of the student body, but 70% of suspensions. Latino students weren't far behind. She cross-referenced the data with incident reports, which were harder to access but available through a staff portal. The patterns were stark. Insubordination, disruptive behavior, attitude problems, vague terms that seemed to target kids of color disproportionately. White students, when disciplined, were more likely to face concrete charges like vandalism or cheating, which carried lighter consequences. Sarah's fingers hovered over her keyboard. She wanted to do something, but what? She wasn't a lawyer or an activist. She was just a teacher, barely making enough to cover her rent and student loans. Confronting the administration directly could cost her job. She thought of her students, Jamal, who'd written a poem about his grandmother's hands that brought the class to silence, Maria, a shy Latina girl who'd blossomed in her creative writing unit, Deshawn, who'd stayed after school to debate The Great Gatsby with her. They deserved better. They deserved a school that didn't punish them for who they were. The next day, Sarah started keeping a notebook. It was small, leather-bound, something she'd bought at a thrift store years ago. She began jotting down every incident she witnessed or heard about. A black student sent to the office for wearing a hoodie, while a white student in the same outfit walked by unnoticed. A Latino boy given detention for loitering in the hallway, while a group of white girls chatting nearby were ignored. She noted dates, times, names, and witnesses. It felt like a small act, almost futile, but it was something. She didn't tell anyone, not even her closest colleague, Rachel, who taught history across the hall. Rachel was kind but cautious, always warning Sarah not to rock the boat. Weeks passed, and the notebook filled. Sarah's unease grew. She started noticing other things: how black and Latino students were less likely to be recommended for advanced placement classes, how their parents' concerns were dismissed at meetings. She overheard Hargrove telling another administrator that some kids just don't know how to behave. His tone dripping with condescension. She felt a fire building inside her, a mix of anger and guilt. She'd been complicit, hadn't she? By staying silent, by teaching her lessons and going home, she'd let this happen. One afternoon, Sarah found Jamal in the library after school. He was supposed to be serving his suspension, but he'd snuck in to return a book. His eyes were downcast, his usual swagger gone. "They're trying to push me out, Ms. Mitchell," he said quietly. "They don't want kids like me here." Sarah's throat tightened. She wanted to tell him he was wrong, that the school valued him, but the words felt hollow. Instead, she asked him to tell her what happened. His story spilled out: how Hargrove had twisted his words, how he'd been labeled a troublemaker since middle school, how his mom was too overworked to fight the system. Sarah listened, her pen moving in her notebook. That night, she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Jamal's words. "They don't want kids like me here." She thought about her own privilege as a white teacher, how she'd never had to navigate the kind of scrutiny her students faced. She thought about the Morrison quote she'd written on the board that morning: "The function of freedom is to free someone else." She'd always loved that line, but now it felt like a challenge, a call to action. The next morning, Sarah made a decision. She couldn't stay silent anymore. She didn't know exactly what she'd do: confront Hargrove, go to the school board, maybe even the media. But she knew she had to act. She started by emailing a local education advocate she'd met at a conference, a woman named Carla who worked with a civil rights group. The email was short, cautious, but it outlined what she'd seen and included a few anonymized examples from her notebook. Carla responded within hours, asking to meet. "This is bigger than you think," she wrote. "We've been hearing similar stories across the district." Sarah's heart raced as she read the reply. She was stepping into something she didn't fully understand, something that could upend her life. But as she looked at her notebook, now nearly full, she thought of Jamal, Maria, Deshaun, and all the kids who deserved a fair shot. She wasn't just a teacher anymore. She was a witness, and she was ready to fight. Sarah Mitchell's hands trembled as she sealed the envelope, her notebook's pages photocopied and tucked inside. She stood outside the post office, the autumn air sharp against her face. It was a Saturday, 2 weeks after her email to Carla, the education advocate. Their meeting had been a whirlwind. Carla had listened intently, her eyes narrowing as Sarah recounted the disparities in Lincoln High's disciplinary records. "This isn't just one school," Carla had said, leaning across the coffee shop table. "It's the district, maybe the state." She'd urged Sarah to send her evidence anonymously to a local journalist, someone known for digging into education issues. Now, as Sarah dropped the envelope into the mailbox, her stomach churned. There was no going back. Lincoln High felt different on Monday. The hallways were the same flickering fluorescence, lockers dented from years of use, but Sarah sensed eyes on her. She hadn't told anyone about the envelope, not even Rachel, her colleague who'd once been her confidant. Rachel had noticed Sarah's distraction lately, asking over lunch if she was okay. Sarah had deflected, talking about lesson plans. She couldn't risk anyone knowing, not yet. But the weight of her secret made every interaction feel like a tightrope walk. Vice Principal Hargrove passed her in the hall, his usual scowl in place. Did he suspect something? She shook off the thought, but her pulse stayed quick. In her classroom, Sarah tried to focus on teaching. Her students were discussing, their eyes were watching God and Maria. The quiet Latina girl who'd started speaking up more raised her hand. "Janie's voice gets stronger when she fights back," Maria said, her words careful but firm. Sarah nodded, encouraging her, but her mind drifted to Jamal. He was back from suspension, sitting in the back row, his usual energy dimmed. She'd caught him after class last week, asking how he was. "They're watching me, Ms. Mitchell," he'd muttered. Like I'm the problem. She'd wanted to hug him, to promise things would change, but all she could offer was a nod and a quiet, "I'm here." Sarah's notebook was still growing. She'd added more incidents. A black student, Tasha, sent to detention for disrespect after rolling her eyes at a teacher's comment. A Latino boy, Miguel, suspended for gang-related behavior because of a red bandana in his backpack, which he'd said was a gift from his grandmother. White students, meanwhile, seemed to skate by. A boy named Ethan had thrown a pencil across the room during a test, hitting another kid. The teacher laughed it off. Sarah wrote it all down, her pen digging into the paper. Each entry felt like a brick in a wall she was building, though she wasn't sure yet when it would protect or destroy. The first sign of trouble came on Wednesday. Sarah was in the staff room, pouring coffee, when she overheard two administrators talking. "Someone's been poking around in the disciplinary files." One said, "A woman named Karen who handled compliance. Central office got a request for data." Sarah's heart skipped. She kept her back to them, stirring her coffee slowly, but her ears strained. "Probably just a parent," the other administrator said, dismissing it. "They never follow through." Sarah exhaled, but the unease lingered. Had her email to Carla triggered this? Or was it the envelope? She didn't know. But the walls felt like they were closing in. That evening, Sarah met Maria's mother, Elena, at a parent-teacher conference. Elena was a single mom, her hands calloused from working double shifts at a diner. She'd come to discuss Maria's progress, but the conversation turned to her son, Luis, a freshman who'd been suspended twice that year. "He's not a bad kid," Elena said, her voice cracking, "but they treat him like he's already a criminal." Sarah hesitated, then asked for details. Luis had been disciplined for loitering and talking back, both vague charges that echoed Jamal's case. Elena's frustration poured out. She'd tried complaining to the principal, but got nowhere. "They don't listen to people like me," she said. Sarah's notebook was in her bag, and she itched to write this down, but she waited. Instead, she promised Elena she'd look into it. It was a small lie. She was already looking, but she couldn't say how. The next day, Sarah's world tilted. A local news blog published a story. Disciplinary disparities at Lincoln High raised questions. It didn't name her, but it cited internal documents and data matching her notebook. The article detailed suspension rates, quoting numbers Sarah had sent to Carla. It mentioned specific cases anonymized, but recognizable to anyone who knew the school. Sarah read it on her phone during lunch, her hands clammy. The journalist had moved fast, faster than she'd expected. The story was gaining traction, shared across social media by parents and activists. By afternoon, the school was buzzing. Students whispered in the halls, and teachers shot Sarah curious glances. Hargrove called an emergency staff meeting. The meeting was tense. Hargrove stood at the front of the library, his tie loosened, his voice clipped. "There's been a breach of confidentiality," he said, his eyes scanning the room. "Someone has shared sensitive information with the press. This is a violation of district policy." Sarah's throat went dry. She kept her face neutral, her hands folded in her lap. Hargrove didn't name her, but his gaze lingered on her a second too long. He went on, talking about loyalty and protecting the school's reputation. A few teachers nodded, but others looked uneasy. Rachel, sitting next to Sarah, whispered, "This is bad, isn't it?" Sarah didn't answer. After the meeting, Sarah's phone lit up with texts from Carla. "You see the article? It's working. But be careful." Sarah didn't reply. She felt exposed, like a spotlight was on her. That night, she barely slept, replaying Hargrove's words. The next morning, she found a note slipped under her classroom door. "Watch your back." It was unsigned, the handwriting unfamiliar. Her first instinct was to crumple it, but she tucked it into her notebook instead. Evidence, she told herself, though it felt like paranoia. The school board responded to the article with a press release, calling the allegations misleading and promising an internal review. It was a deflection, but it bought them time. Parents, though, weren't waiting. A group led by Elena organized a protest outside the school, holding signs that read "Fairness for our kids" and "Stop punishing black and brown students." Sarah watched from her classroom window, her heart swelling and sinking at once. She wanted to join them, but Carla had warned her to stay low. "You're the whistleblower," she'd said. "If they find out it's you, they'll come for your job." The protest made the evening news, and Sarah's name stayed out of it for now. But the retaliation began subtly. Her lesson plans were suddenly under review by the curriculum office. Hargrove started dropping by her classes unannounced, scribbling notes as she taught. A parent complained about her biased grading, though the accusation was vague and unsubstantiated. Sarah felt the pressure mounting, but she didn't stop. She met with Carla again, this time at a park far from school. Carla brought a lawyer, a man named David, who specialized in education law. "You've got enough for a lawsuit," he said, flipping through her notebook. "Federal civil rights violation, disparate impact." Sarah blinked, overwhelmed. A lawsuit? She'd never imagined going that far. David explained the risks: legal fees, public scrutiny, maybe losing her job. But he also talked about the potential, forcing the district to change, protecting kids like Jamal and Luis. Sarah thought of Maria, reading her essay aloud in class that morning, her voice steady and proud. She thought of Tasha, who'd stopped coming to school after her detention. She thought of the note under her door. "I'm in," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. That night, Sarah sat at her kitchen table, her notebook open. She added the day's events: the article, the protest, Hargrove's veiled threats. She wrote until her hand ached, the pages a testament to her resolve. She didn't know what came next, but she knew she couldn't turn back. The system she'd trusted was broken, and she was done staying silent. For her students, for herself, she would fight. Sarah Mitchell sat in a cramped law office downtown, her notebook open on the table, its pages worn from constant handling. The room smelled of stale coffee and old paper, and the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly. Across from her, David, the lawyer Carla had introduced, scribbled notes as she spoke. It was early November, and the air outside carried the bite of approaching winter. Sarah's decision to pursue a lawsuit against the school district felt like a stone in her chest, heavy, unyielding, but necessary. The news article and the parent protest had shaken Lincoln High, but the school board's promise of an internal review was a flimsy bandage on a gaping wound. Sarah knew real change wouldn't come without a fight. David leaned back, his glasses slipping down his nose. "We're filing under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act," he said, his voice steady but urgent. "Disparate impact. Your data shows Black and Latino students are disciplined at disproportionate rates for subjective infractions. That's our case." Sarah nodded, though the legal jargon felt like a foreign language. She'd spent the past week digging deeper into the district's records, with Carla's help, pulling reports that showed the same patterns across multiple schools. Her notebook now held over 50 documented incidents, each a story of a kid like Jamal or Luis, punished for things that white students got away with. David flipped through the pages, his expression grim. "This is solid, but it's going to get ugly." Ugly was already here. At school, Sarah felt like a ghost. Colleagues who once chatted with her in the staff room now avoided her eyes. Rachel, her closest friend on the faculty, had pulled her aside yesterday, her voice low. "People are talking, Sarah. They think you're the leak." Sarah had shrugged, her face a mask, but her stomach twisted. Hargrove's unannounced classroom visits had become daily, his clipboard a silent threat. Last week, he'd criticized her for letting a student read a poem about police brutality, calling it inappropriate. She'd argued it was part of the curriculum, but his smirk said he wasn't listening. The note under her door, "Watch your back," still sat in her notebook, a reminder of the stakes. The lawsuit was filed on a gray Tuesday morning, a federal complaint naming the school district for systemic discrimination. Sarah wasn't listed as a plaintiff. David had advised keeping her anonymous for now, citing whistleblower protections, but her evidence was the backbone. The filing cited suspension rates, incident reports, and anonymized student stories, all drawn from her notebook. Carla had connected Sarah with two other plaintiffs, Elena, Maria's mother, whose son Luis faced expulsion for repeated infractions, and a black father, Marcus, whose daughter Tasha had dropped out after relentless detentions. Their names gave the case weight, grounding it in real families' pain. The news broke fast. By noon, local TV stations were outside Lincoln High, cameras panning the brick facade as reporters talked about allegations of racism. Sarah watched from her classroom, the blinds half drawn, as students gathered in the parking lot, some holding signs from the earlier protest. Jamal was there, his hoodie pulled up. Chatting with the others, Maria stood nearby, quieter but present, her eyes fierce. Sarah's heart swelled. She hadn't told her students about the lawsuit, but they were fighting anyway. A few white students joined, though others hung back, their faces uncertain. The community was splitting, and Sarah felt the fracture in her bones. At school, the administration doubled down. Principal Carter, a polished woman who'd always seemed neutral, sent a district-wide email defending the school's fair and equitable policies. Hargrove held another staff meeting, this time warning about disloyalty and legal consequences for sharing internal information. Sarah sat in the back, her pulse racing. As he mentioned ongoing investigations into staff conduct, she knew he meant her. That afternoon, a parent filed a formal complaint against her, claiming she'd indoctrinated students with divisive lessons. The accusation was baseless. Her curriculum was district approved, but it was another jab, another way to isolate her. Outside school, the backlash grew. Sarah's phone buzzed with notifications from social media, where the article had been shared thousands of times. Some comments praised the lawsuit, calling it long overdue. Others were vicious, accusing the plaintiffs of playing the race card or attacking teachers. A few targeted Sarah directly, though her name wasn't public. That English teacher needs to be fired, one post read, posted by an account she didn't recognize. She stopped checking her phone, but the words lingered. At home, she locked her doors and kept her curtains drawn, the weight of her choice pressing harder. But there were glimmers of hope. Elena called her that night, her voice thick with gratitude. "You gave us a chance, Ms. Mitchell," she said. "Luis is still in school, because of you." Sarah's eyes stung. She hadn't realized Luis's expulsion hearing had been delayed, likely because of the lawsuit's pressure. Jamal stopped by her classroom the next day, slipping her a folded note before leaving. It was a poem, rough but raw, about a kid caged by rules that don't fit. She tucked it into her notebook, next to the threatening note. Both were evidence, in their own way. The students were organizing now. Maria and Jamal had started a group, calling it Justice for Lincoln. They met after school in the library, planning protests and drafting a petition for fair discipline policies. Sarah stayed on the sidelines, as David had advised, but she overheard their conversations in the halls. They talked about Tasha, who'd stopped coming to school, and others who'd been pushed out. They wanted their voices heard. One evening, Maria asked Sarah to read their petition. It was simple but powerful, listing demands, transparent disciplinary data, bias training for staff, and an end to zero tolerance for minor infractions. Sarah's throat tightened as she read it. These were her kids, fighting for themselves. Carla and David were building the case, gathering more evidence. They'd requested additional district records, including emails between administrators, hoping to find proof of intentional bias. Sarah helped where she could, pointing them to specific policies or staff members who'd made questionable decisions. She felt like a spy in her own workplace, her loyalty torn between her students and the system she'd once believed in. At night, she lay awake, imagining the courtroom. Would her notebook hold up? Would the judge see what she saw? David had warned that disparate impact cases were hard to win. The district could argue their policies were colorblind, but Sarah's data, and the stories behind it, told a different truth. The community response was a mixed bag. A local church held a forum on school equity, inviting Elena and Marcus to speak. Sarah attended, sitting in the back, her face half hidden by a scarf. The room was packed. Parents, teachers, even a few school board members. Elena spoke about Luis, her voice shaking but clear, and Marcus told Tash's story, his anger barely contained. The crowd was split. Some clapped, others whispered skeptically. A white parent stood up, saying, "Discipline isn't racism, it's about behavior." Sarah's hands clenched. She wanted to argue, to show them her notebook, but she stayed silent, her anonymity her shield. Back at school, the pressure intensified. Hargrove called Sarah into his office, his tone icy. "Your name keeps coming up, Ms. Mitchell," he said, leaning across his desk. "Parents are concerned about your teaching methods." He slid a folder toward her, containing the complaint about indoctrination. Sarah scanned it. Vague accusations, no evidence. "This is nonsense," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Hargrove's eyes narrowed. "We're watching you." She left his office, her legs shaking, and added the encounter to her notebook. It was another brick in her wall. By the end of the week, the lawsuit was national news. A major outlet picked up the story, linking it to similar cases in other states. Sarah's name still hadn't surfaced, but the scrutiny was relentless. She stopped eating lunch in the staff room, tired of the sideways glances. Rachel texted her, asking to meet, but Sarah didn't reply. She trusted Rachel, but trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. At home, she kept writing, her notebook now a lifeline. She wrote about the students' petition, the church forum, Hargrove's threats. She wrote about her fear, her guilt, her hope. The lawsuit was just the beginning. She knew. The real fight was for her kids, for Jamal's poetry, Maria's courage, Luce's future. She wasn't backing down. Sarah Mitchell's apartment felt smaller than ever, the walls closing in as she sat cross-legged on her couch, her laptop glowing with a news article about the Lincoln High lawsuit. It was late December, and the city outside was draped in a thin layer of snow, muffling the usual sounds of traffic. The lawsuit, now a month old, had become a lightning rod. National outlets had picked it up, framing it as a test case for school equity. And Sarah's name had finally surfaced. A reporter had connected the dots: her notebook, her meetings with Carla, her absence from the plaintiff's public statements. The headline read, "Teacher Behind Lawsuit Faces Backlash." Her stomach knotted as she scrolled through the comments, a mix of support and venom. "Hero," some called her. "Troublemaker," said others. One anonymous post stood out. "She's tearing our school apart." The school district had fired her 2 weeks ago, citing unprofessional conduct and breach of confidentiality. The termination letter, signed by Principal Carter, listed vague offenses: sharing internal data, disrupting school operations, and the parent complaint about indoctrination. Sarah had expected it, but the reality hit hard. Her income was gone, her savings meager. She'd already skipped a rent payment, and her student loans loomed like a storm cloud. Her parents, who lived an hour away, had called last night, their voices heavy with worry. "You're throwing your life away, Sarah," her mother said. "You can't fix everything." Sarah had hung up, tears stinging her eyes. She wasn't trying to fix everything, just her school, her kids. Lincoln High was a different place without her. She'd heard from Maria, who texted updates about the student group, Justice for Lincoln. The kids were still meeting, still protesting, but Hargrove had cracked down, threatening suspensions for unauthorized gatherings. Jamal had been sent home again, this time for defiance, after refusing to remove his hoodie at a rally. Maria said the mood was tense, with teachers taking sides and students feeling watched. Sarah's absence left a void. Her classroom, once a safe space, was now led by a substitute who stuck to worksheets and avoided discussion. Maria's texts were a lifeline, but each one reminded Sarah of what she'd lost. The lawsuit was gaining momentum, but it came at a cost. David, the lawyer, had warned her about the district's tactics, and they were playing dirty. The school board hired a high-powered law firm, known for defending districts in civil rights cases. Their first move was a smear campaign. A local radio host, popular among conservative parents, called Sarah a radical activist who'd manipulated students into protesting. The district leaked emails carefully selected showing Sarah questioning administrative decisions, painting her as insubordinate. One email, sent to Rachel months ago, complained about Hargrove's bias. It was private. Or so she'd thought. Now it was plastered across a blog, twisted to make her look unhinged. Sarah's days were a blur of anxiety and action. She met with David and Carla weekly, reviewing discovery documents the district had been forced to turn over. The emails were damning. Hargrove had written to another administrator about problem students who needed to be taught a lesson, with names like Jamal and Luis popping up repeatedly. Another email from Principal Carter dismissed a parent's complaint about racial profiling as overblown. Sarah's notebook was still the heart of the case, but the new evidence strengthened it. David was optimistic, but cautious. "They'll try to bury us in paperwork," he said, "and they'll keep coming for you." The personal toll was mounting. Sarah's social media accounts were flooded with messages, some supportive, but many hateful. Someone had doxed her, posting her address online. She'd found a crude drawing of a noose taped to her mailbox, the word traitor scrawled across it. She called the police, but they shrugged it off as a prank. She started sleeping with a baseball bat by her bed, her nerves frayed. Her friends, those who hadn't drifted away, urged her to back off, to settle. Even Carla, fierce as ever, admitted the fight was taking a toll. "You're carrying too much," she said at their last meeting. Sarah shook her head. "I can't stop now. Not for them, her students. Jamal, Maria, Luis, Tasha, the kids who kept her going." Elena had invited her to a community meeting at a local rec center, organized by parents and activists. Sarah went, despite David's warnings about staying low. The room was packed, the air thick with anger and hope. Elena spoke first, her voice stronger than before, recounting Luce's suspensions and the district's dismissal of her concerns. Marcus, Tasha's father, followed, his words raw as he described his daughter's dropout. Then a surprise, Jamal took the mic. He was taller than Sarah remembered, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Ms. Mitchell believed in us," he said. "She saw what they were doing. We're fighting for her, too." The crowd erupted, and Sarah, sitting in the back, covered her mouth to hide her sobs. That night, a national civil rights organization reached out. They'd seen the lawsuit's coverage and wanted to join as co-counsel, offering resources and legal muscle. David was thrilled. It meant more funding, more expertise. Sarah felt a flicker of relief, but it was fleeting. The organization's involvement made the case bigger, but also more public. Her name was everywhere now, tied to hashtags like #JusticeForLincoln and #RacistSchools. She couldn't go to the grocery store without feeling watched, judged. A cashier had recognized her, whispering to a co-worker as Sarah bagged her groceries. She stopped going out unless she had to. Financially, she was drowning. Her savings were nearly gone, and her unemployment claim was tied up in red tape, likely stalled by the district. Carla set up a crowdfunding page, which raised a few $1,000s from supporters. But it wasn't enough. Sarah sold her old car, a beat-up Honda she'd driven since college, to cover bills. She started tutoring online, but the pay was sporadic. Her parents offered to help, but their tone, pity mixed with disapproval, made her refuse. She wasn't their little girl anymore. She was a fighter, even if it was breaking her. The students kept her anchored. Maria sent her a video of a Justice for Lincoln rally, where kids read poems and shared stories of unfair discipline. Jamal's poem, the one he'd given her, was performed by a shy freshman, her voice cracking but clear. Sarah watched it on loop, tears streaming down her face. Elena texted updates about Luis, who'd been allowed to stay in school pending the lawsuit's outcome. Tasha, though, was still gone, and Sarah felt that loss like a wound. She wrote to her, a long letter apologizing for not doing more, but Marcus said Tasha wasn't ready to talk. Sarah kept the letter in her notebook, next to Jamal's poem and the noose drawing. The lawsuit's next phase loomed, depositions. David was preparing to question Hargrove, Carter, and other administrators, using Sarah's evidence to corner them. She'd have to be deposed to, her testimony critical. The thought terrified her, not the questions, but the exposure. Her life was already an open wound, picked at by strangers and former colleagues. Yet she kept going, driven by the kids' faces, their voices. At night, she'd sit with her notebook, now a bulging archive of pain and proof. She wrote about the rec center meeting, the civil rights group, the noose. She wrote about her fear, her rage, her love for her students. The lawsuit was her weapon, but the notebook was her soul. She wasn't just fighting for justice, she was fighting to be seen, to make her kids seen, and no matter the cost, she wouldn't stop. Sarah Mitchell sat in the witness box, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, the courtroom air thick with tension. It was mid-March, and the federal courthouse in downtown Ohio was a stark contrast to Lincoln High's worn. Hallways polished wood paneling, high ceilings, and the faint hum of a heater battling the late winter chill. The lawsuit against the school district had reached its trial phase, and Sarah's testimony was the linchpin. Her notebook, now an official exhibit, sat on the plaintiff's table, its pages tabbed and annotated by David's legal team. The gallery was packed: parents, reporters, activists, and a few Lincoln High students, including Maria and Jamal, who'd skipped school to be there. Sarah avoided their eyes, afraid she'd falter under the weight of their hope. The district's lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Ms. Grayson, stood across from her, her voice clipped and precise. "Ms. Mitchell, you claim the school's disciplinary policies were discriminatory, yet you never raised these concerns through proper channels. Did you?" Sarah's throat tightened. She'd expected this. David had prepped her for hours, warning that the defense would paint her as a rogue employee. "I tried," she said, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. "I spoke to Vice Principal Hargrove multiple times. He dismissed me." Grayson raised an eyebrow, holding up an email Sarah had sent to Rachel, the one leaked months ago. "This suggests you were more interested in stirring trouble than solving problems, doesn't it?" Sarah's jaw clenched. "No doubt it shows I was frustrated because no one would listen." The trial had begun 2 weeks ago, a grueling process that felt like a war of attrition. David and the civil rights organization's lawyers had built a meticulous case, using Sarah's notebook, district emails, and statistical data to argue that Lincoln High's policies disproportionately harmed Black and Latino students. They'd presented expert witnesses, education researchers, who testified about systemic bias in school discipline, and parents like Elena and Marcus, whose stories brought the numbers to life. Elena's testimony about Luce's near expulsion had left the courtroom silent, her voice breaking as she described begging the school to give her son a chance. Marcus, speaking about Tasha's dropout, had stared directly at the defense table, his anger palpable. The judge, a stern woman with gray streaks in her hair, listened impassively, her pen moving across a legal pad. Sarah's testimony was the emotional core. She'd taken the stand yesterday, guided by David through her journey discovering the disparities, documenting incidents, leaking the data. She'd spoken about Jamal's suspension for joking in the hallway, Tasha's detention for rolling her eyes, Luce's bandana labeled as gang-related. Each story was backed by her notebook, its entries projected on a screen for the court. The defense had objected repeatedly, calling the evidence anecdotal, but the judge allowed it, noting its cumulative weight. Today was cross-examination, and Grayson was relentless, probing for weaknesses. "You were fired for breaching confidentiality, correct?" she asked. Sarah nodded. "Yes, but I was protecting my students." Grayson smirked. "By breaking the law," Sarah's voice hardened. "By exposing the truth." The courtroom wasn't the only battleground. Outside, the case had polarized the city. Protests swelled, with Justice for Lincoln leading marches that drew hundreds. Maria and Jamal had become unofficial spokespeople, their faces on local news as they demanded reform. A counter-protest, smaller but vocal, gathered weekly, led by parents who claimed the lawsuit was anti-teacher and divisive. Social media was a cesspool. Sarah's name trended alongside hashtags like #FireMitchell and #SaveOurKids. Someone had spray-painted "Race Traitor" on her apartment building's door, and though the landlord scrubbed it off, the image lingered in her mind. She'd moved to a cheaper, smaller place after falling behind on rent, her belongings crammed into boxes she hadn't unpacked. The crowdfunding page Carla set up kept her afloat, but barely. The trial's evidence phase had revealed more than Sarah expected. David's team uncovered a training manual used by Lincoln High's staff, emphasizing strict enforcement for disruptive behaviors like defiance or disrespect. terms vague enough to target anyone. Emails showed Hargrove instructing teachers to flag certain students, with names like Jamal and Luis appearing repeatedly. One message from Hargrove to Principal Carter read, "We need to send a message to these kids early." The defense argued it was about maintaining order, not race, but the plaintiff's experts dismantled that, pointing to national studies on implicit bias. The district's own data was damning. Black students were suspended at 4 times the rate of white students for similar infractions. Sarah's life outside the courtroom was a shadow of what it had been. She hadn't taught since her firing, and tutoring gigs were scarce. Her name was too toxic. Her parents had stopped calling, their silence louder than their earlier disapproval. Rachel, her former colleague, sent a hesitant text, "I wish I'd said more back then." "I'm sorry," Sarah didn't reply. Trust was a casualty of this war. Carla remained her rock, meeting her after each court day to debrief over coffee. "You're holding up better than most," Carla said last night, her eyes kind but tired. Sarah shook her head. I'm just too stubborn to quit." Carla laughed, but Sarah meant it. Quitting wasn't an option, not with her kids in the gallery. Watching, the student's presence was a double-edged sword. Maria's quiet strength, Jamal's defiant poetry. Even Luce's awkward wave from the back row, they fueled Sarah. But they also reminded her of the stakes. Tasha's absence was a constant ache. Marcus had told Sarah that Tasha was working at a fast food place. Refusing to return to school, Sarah still carried the unsent letter to her, its words a plea for forgiveness. The Justice for Lincoln group had grown, now meeting at a community center since the school cracked down. They'd launched a website, sharing stories of unfair discipline, and it had gone viral. Drawing attention from national activists, Sarah read their posts in secret, her heart swelling at their courage but breaking at their pain. Grayson's cross-examination stretched into the afternoon, each question a jab. "Did you ever consider the impact of your actions on the school's reputation?" she asked. Sarah leaned forward, her voice clear. "I considered the impact on my students. They were being punished for who they were," the gallery murmured, and the judge rapped her gavel. Grayson pivoted, asking about Sarah's personal biases, implying she'd exaggerated the disparities to push an agenda. Sarah's temper flared, but she kept it in check, citing her notebook's data dates, times, witnesses. "I didn't make this up," she said. "I saw it. I lived it." Grayson sat down, her expression unreadable. The defense called their witnesses necks. Hargrove took the stand, his tie to tight, his voice defensive. He claimed the school's policies were colorblind, and that Sarah's allegations were misinterpretations. David's cross-examination was surgical, forcing Hargrove to admit he'd never reviewed the district's suspension data for racial disparities. Principal Carter followed, her polished demeanor cracking when David presented her email dismissing a parent's complaint. The defense's final witness, a district consultant, argued that cultural differences explained the discipline gap, a claim the plaintiff's experts had already debunked. The gallery shifted restlessly, sensing the defense's case unraveling. Closing arguments were days away, and Sarah felt the weight of the unknown. David was confident the evidence was strong, the judge attentive, but nothing was certain. At night, she sat with her notebook, now a relic of her old life. She added entries about the trial, Elena's testimony, Jamal's presence, Grayson's questions. She wrote about the paint on her door, the emptiness of her apartment, the kids' faces in the gallery. She wrote about Tasha, an apology she might never deliver. The notebook was her anchor, proof that this wasn't just a fight for her, it was for every kid who'd been pushed out, labeled, forgotten. The community remained divided. A local paper ran an op-ed praising Sarah as a whistleblower with courage, but another called her a disgruntled employee. Protests continued, with Justice for Lincoln planning a rally outside the courthouse on the trial's final day. Sarah wouldn't join, she couldn't, with the media watching, but she felt their energy. Maria had slipped her a note yesterday, folded tight. "We're with you, Ms. Mitchell." Inside was a drawing of a fist, raised high, surrounded by names Jamal, Luis, Tasha, and dozens more. Sarah taped it to her fridge, a reminder of why she was here. As the trial neared its end, Sarah felt both hollow and alive. The courtroom had stripped her bare, her fears, her choices, her truth, but it had also given her purpose. She wasn't just a teacher anymore, or even a whistleblower. She was a voice for her students, a mirror to a system that had failed them. Whatever the verdict, she'd carry their stories forward. Her notebook, her heart, her fight, they were all for them. Sarah Mitchell stood outside the federal courthouse, her breath visible in the April morning air. As the crowd across the street chanted her name, the trial had ended, and the judge's ruling had just been delivered, a landmark victory for the plaintiffs. The school district was found liable for violating Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, with its disciplinary practices deemed discriminatory against Black and Latino students. The court mandated sweeping reforms, revised policies, mandatory bias training for staff, and an independent monitor to oversee compliance for 5 years. Sarah's notebook, her meticulous record of injustice, had been cited in the judge's opinion as compelling evidence of systemic bias. The crowd, led by Justice for Lincoln, waved signs reading "Victory for our kids" and "Thank you, Ms. Mitchell." Yet, as Sarah watched, her hands stuffed in her coat pockets, she felt no triumph, only a hollow ache. The verdict was a win, but it came with scars. Sarah hadn't taught in months, her career in ruins. Her apartment was a single room now, her belongings pared down to fit her shrinking life. The crowdfunding page had dried up, and her savings were gone. She'd taken a part-time job at a bookstore, shelving novels she no longer had time to read, but it barely covered rent. The trial's aftermath had brought no relief. Hate mail still arrived, slipped under her door or posted online, calling her a race baiter or worse. A brick had shattered her window last week, the word "bitch" scratched into it. She'd taped cardboard over the hole, too broke to fix it. Her parents had sent a check, but she returned it, their silence during the trial louder than their belated gesture. Lincoln High was changing, but not without resistance. The court's reforms were rolling out, but Hargrove and Principal Carter remained in their roles. A sore point for parents like Elena. The district had issued a public apology, admitting unintentional disparities while avoiding the word racism. Elena texted Sarah updates. New disciplinary guidelines were posted, and suspensions had dropped slightly. But some teachers grumbled about special treatment for Black and Latino kids. Jamal, now a senior, was back in school, his record cleared of minor infractions. But he told Sarah the vibe was still tense. "They're following the rules, but they don't like it," he said. Maria, ever resilient, was helping rewrite the student handbook, her quiet voice shaping policy. Luis was thriving, his expulsion threat lifted. But Tasha remained a ghost, working double shifts at a diner, unreachable. The community was fractured. The verdict had galvanized supporters, with Justice for Lincoln growing into a statewide advocacy group. Their rallies drew thousands, and their website was a hub for student stories, some from other districts, but backlash persisted. A group of parents, backed by a conservative think tank, filed an appeal, arguing the ruling vilified teachers and eroded discipline. Local radio hosts fanned the flames, calling the reforms reverse racism. Sarah's name was a lightning rod, praised by activists, vilified by those who saw her as a traitor. A school board meeting last week had erupted into shouts, with one parent screaming that Sarah had ruined our kids' future. She hadn't attended, but the video was all over social media. Sarah's personal life was a casualty of the fight. Friends she'd once counted on had faded away, unable to handle the spotlight or the hate. Rachel, her former colleague, had tried to reconnect, but Sarah kept her at arm's length. Trust was too fragile. Carla was her anchor, meeting her weekly at a diner far from the city's chaos. "You changed things, Sarah," Carla said last night, her voice firm. "Not enough, but it's a start." Sarah nodded, but the words felt distant. She'd started the fight for her students, but now she was jobless, isolated, and haunted by the kids she couldn't save, like Tasha. Her notebook, once her lifeline, sat untouched on a shelf, too heavy with memories to open. The victory had sparked something new, though. At a community forum after the ruling, Elena had pulled Sarah aside, her eyes bright. "We're starting something," she said, "a non-profit for kids like Luis." Sarah listened, hesitant but intrigued. Elena and Marcus had been meeting with activists, pooling resources to create a group. focused on equitable education advocacy, legal support, mentorship. They wanted Sarah to join, to lead it. "You're the one who saw it first," Marcus said, his voice softer than during the trial. Sarah hadn't committed. She was too drained, too broke, but the idea stuck. A flicker of purpose in the fog. The nonprofit took shape faster than she expected. By late April, they had a name: Equity in Education, and a small office, rented with donations from the civil rights organization that had backed the lawsuit. Sarah agreed to consult, unpaid for now, helping draft their mission to challenge discriminatory school practices and support students of color. She met with Elena and Marcus weekly, sketching out programs, workshops for parents, tutoring for kids like Tasha, who'd been pushed out. Jamal and Maria volunteered, their energy infectious. Jamal designed flyers, his poetry woven into the text, while Maria organized a youth council. Sarah watched them, her heart swelling but heavy. They were rebuilding what the system had broken, but the cost was still raw. The district's appeal loomed, a reminder that the fight wasn't over. David warned that it could drag on for years. Though he doubted it would overturn the ruling, the reforms were holding. But implementation was spotty. Some teachers embraced the bias training, but others resisted, calling it woke nonsense. Hargrove had been caught on a hot mic complaining about forced equality, a clip that went viral and fueled calls for his removal. Sarah stayed out of the spotlight, letting Elena and Marcus take the lead at press conferences. Her name was too divisive, her face too recognizable. She'd been approached by a publisher about a book deal, but she turned it down. Her story wasn't hers alone, and she wasn't ready to profit from it. The students faced their own battles. Jamal was applying to colleges, his essays raw with his Lincoln High experience, but he worried about affording tuition. Maria was set to graduate with honors, her sights on a teaching degree. She wanted to be like Sarah, but without the firing part, she joked. Luis was back on track, his grades improving, but he still flinched when Hargrove passed him in the hall. Tasha's absence gnawed at Sarah. Marcus had given her Tasha's number, and Sarah called, leaving a voicemail that went unanswered. She rewrote her letter, sending it this time, but got no reply. She kept it in her mind, a wound that wouldn't heal. Sarah's days were a mix of survival and purpose. The bookstore job paid the bills just. She spent evenings at the nonprofit's office, drafting grant applications and planning a summer program. The work was unpaid, but it kept her tethered to her students' fight. She avoided social media, tired of the hate, but couldn't escape the news. A national outlet ran a profile on her, calling her the teacher who wouldn't quit. It was kinder than most, but it glossed over the toll: her empty fridge, her sleepless nights, the panic attacks that hit when she heard a noise outside her door. She wasn't a hero, just a woman who'd seen too much to stay silent. The community was healing. Slowly, a town hall hosted by Equity in Education drew a diverse crowd: parents, teachers, even a few school board members. Elena spoke about Luce's progress, Marcus about Tasha's loss, and Jamal read a new poem, his voice steady. Sarah stayed in the back, her presence quiet but felt. A white parent, one who'd opposed the lawsuit, approached her afterward, her voice halting. "I didn't get it before," she said. "I'm starting to." Sarah nodded, unsure if she believed her, but it was a crack in the wall. Change was messy, incomplete, but it was there. Sarah's notebook stayed closed, but her fight didn't. She was building something new, not just for Lincoln High but for every kid who'd been labeled a problem. The verdict had given her a platform, but it was her students: Jamal's words, Maria's resolve, Luce's survival that gave her strength. Tasha's silence was her reminder to keep going, to make sure no one else was lost. The nonprofit was a seed, fragile but growing, and Sarah was its reluctant gardener. She wasn't whole, but she was here, still fighting, still theirs. Sarah Mitchell stood at the edge of a small stage in a community center, her hands gripping a podium as she looked out at a crowd of familiar faces. It was May 2027, 2 years since the federal court's ruling against the Lincoln High School district, and the room was filled with students, parents, and activists gathered for the first annual Equity in Education Gala. The nonprofit she'd helped found with Elena and Marcus had grown from a scrappy idea into a force, advocating for fair school policies across Ohio and beyond. The air buzzed with pride, but Sarah's heart was heavy with the weight of the journey, her students' victories, her own losses, and the work still undone. A banner above her read, "For every child," a phrase Maria had suggested, now the nonprofit's motto. Lincoln High had changed, though not as much as Sarah had hoped. The court's reforms revised disciplinary policies, bias training, and an independent monitor had taken root, but progress was uneven. Suspension rates for Black and Latino students had dropped by 30%, a win Elena celebrated at every town hall, but some teachers still resisted, whispering about lowered standards. Hargrove had finally been pushed out last year, caught falsifying compliance reports. But Principal Carter clung to her role, her apologies polished but hollow. The school board, under pressure from Justice for Lincoln, had adopted a new equity plan, partly written by Maria, now a college freshman studying education. Yet, for every step forward, there was pushback. A parent group still lobbied to roll back reforms, claiming they favored certain students. Sarah's life was a patchwork of purpose and survival. She hadn't returned to teaching. Her name was still too divisive, her firing a scarlet letter. She worked full-time for Equity in Education now, her salary modest but enough to move into a small house, a step up from the cramped apartment of her trial days. The nonprofit had secured grants, thanks to Carla's connections, and ran programs in 10 districts, parent workshops, student mentorship, legal clinics for families like Luce's. Sarah led training sessions, teaching educators to spot bias and discipline, her voice steady but laced with the pain of her own experience. At night, she'd collapse on her couch, her old notebook untouched but never far, a silent witness to her fight. The students were her anchor. Jamal, now a sophomore at a state university, stood in the crowd tonight, his lanky frame taller, his smile wide. He'd won a scholarship. His college essays about Lincoln High's injustices catching an admissions officer's eye. He'd read a poem at the gala's opening, his words sharp and hopeful, earning a standing ovation. Maria was there too, home for the weekend, her quiet confidence now a force. She'd started a campus chapter of Justice for Lincoln, mentoring high schoolers. Luis, a junior, was thriving, his grades strong enough for college talk, though he still carried a wary edge from his years of scrutiny. Their success was Sarah's fuel, but Tasha's absence was a shadow. She'd never responded to Sarah's letter or calls, and Marcus said she'd moved away, chasing a fresh start. Sarah kept her photo on her desk, a reminder of the kids she couldn't reach. The gala was a celebration, but also a call to action. Elena spoke first, her voice clear as she recounted Luce's journey from expulsion's edge to honor roll. Marcus followed, his words raw about Tasha's loss, but hopeful about the nonprofit's work. A surprise guest took the stage, Tasha herself, back in town for the first time. The room hushed as she spoke, her voice soft but steady. "I didn't think anyone cared," she said, glancing at Sarah. "But Ms. Mitchell did. This place does." She'd enrolled in a GED program, inspired by a mentor from Equity in Education, and planned to study social work. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, her guilt easing but not gone. Tasha's return was a gift, but the years lost weren't. The community had healed, imperfectly. Justice for Lincoln was now a statewide network, its website a platform for student voices. Some as young as middle school, protests had quieted, replaced by policy wins to districts had banned zero-tolerance policies, citing Sarah's case, but division lingered. A local paper ran a retrospective on the lawsuit, praising Sarah but noting the bitter divide it left. Some parents, once vocal opponents, now attended Equity in Education workshops, their perspectives shifting slowly. At the gala, a white teacher from Lincoln High approached Sarah, her voice low. "I didn't see it then," she said. "I do now." Sarah nodded, wary but open. Trust was hard, but she was learning. Sarah's personal life was still a work in progress. Carla remained her rock, their diner meetups a ritual. Rachel had reconnected, helping fundraise for the nonprofit, and Sarah was starting to forgive her silence during the trial. Her parents had visited last month, their pride cautious, but real. They'd framed a news clipping about the verdict. A small bridge rebuilt. Sarah dated sparingly, her heart guarded. The fight had left little room for love. She'd started therapy, grappling with the panic attacks that still hit when she saw an unfamiliar car outside her house. The hate mail had slowed, but never stopped. A letter last week called her a disgrace. She burned it, her hands steady. The nonprofit was Sarah's legacy, but it belonged to the students. Jamal designed its logo, a raised fist holding a pencil. Maria led its youth council, training kids to advocate for themselves. Hawkins. Luis mentored younger students, his humor a light in heavy moments. The gala showcased their work, a video of student testimonials, a panel of parents trained to navigate school hearings, a scholarship fund for kids like Tasha. Sarah's speech was brief, her voice cracking as she thanked the crowd. "This isn't my story," she said. "It's theirs, Jamal's, Maria's, Luz's, Tasha's. Keep fighting for them." The applause was thunderous, but Sarah stepped off the stage, her eyes on her students, not the crowd. The fight wasn't over. The district's appeal had fizzled, the ruling upheld. But new battles loomed: funding cuts, resistant administrators, kids still slipping through cracks. Equity in education was pushing for statewide laws, inspired by Lincoln High's reforms. And Sarah was meeting with legislators, her notebooks lessons now policy briefs. She wasn't the teacher she'd been, but she was something more: a voice for the voiceless, a fighter who'd paid the price and kept going. As the gala ended, Tasha hugged her, a quiet thank you that felt like absolution. Sarah drove home, the stars bright above, her heart full but restless. The system was still broken, but she'd cracked it open, and her students were carrying the torch for them. She'd fight forever.